Welcome to CinemaSpection. I'm Tim.
I'm Corinne.
It received mixed reviews and middling box office returns in 1982, but has gone on to become one of the most influential science fiction films ever made, leaving its mark not only on cinema, but literature, art, fashion, comics, video games, and philosophy. So put on your trench coat and grab your umbrella. We're stepping out onto the moody streets of Ridley Scott's Blade Runner.
I need your deck. This is a bad one, the worst yet. There was an escape from the off-world colonies 2 weeks ago. 6 replicants, 3 male, 3 female. They slaughtered 20...
A Blade Runner's job is to hunt down replicants. Manufactured humans you can't tell from the real thing. There was just one outfit making replicants that superhuman. The Tyrell Corporation.
Commerce is our goal here at Tyrell. More human than human is our motto.
I was looking for 6 replicants in a city of 106 million people.
You ever see this girl, huh?
What I didn't know was they were looking for me.
Time to die.
On the overcrowded streets of Los Angeles in 2019, a quartet of replicants hide among the population. These artificially created humanoids had violently escaped from an off-world colony. They are now pursued by Blade Runners, cops who track and eliminate replicants. Deckard was a Blade Runner who was forced out of retirement to find the fugitives. Over the course of the investigation, Deckard grows closer to an experimental replicant whose false memories lead her to believe she is human. The relationship opens his eyes to the violent nature of his work and causes Deckard to question his own humanity.
As usual, we'll be discussing Blade Runner in detail, so if you haven't seen the movie and wish to remain unspoiled, we recommend watching the film before listening to the rest of this episode. And while we'll be discussing the various versions of the film, we're mostly going to be focusing on the final cut version. Blade Runner was released by Warner Brothers on June 25th, 1982, where it opened against Megaforce and The Thing. It opened 2 weeks after E.T., and the next 2 weeks would see the releases of The Secret of NIMH and Tron, so in that crowded summer of 1982, it kind of got lost. It was shot at a budget of $28 million, pretty big for its day, but the box office only made $27.5 million on its original release. With its re-releases, it added another $5.2 million to that total. The film won the Hugo for Best Dramatic Presentation that year, and was nominated for Oscars for its visual effects and art direction. It lost the Visual Effects Award to E.T. and the Art Direction Award to Gandhi. Also, the score by Vangelis was nominated for the Golden Globe and a BAFTA. And the film is based on the novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. Corinne, what's your history with Blade Runner?
I believe this is a movie my brother introduced me to. I remember being intrigued but not very impressed at the time. I found it was a little too slow for me. I think this was right after we saw 2001 and I was like, can we just see a movie that has more dialogue? But I grew to love it, and funny story, I went on a date and I got to pick a movie, and I picked Blade Runner, and we watched half of it, and he was bored, and that was our last date.
And boy, am I grateful for that. As for me, Blade Runner was one of those movies I'd heard of for years and years, and it was one of the most important sci-fi films ever made, so I finally got around to renting it and absolutely loved it, except for the ending. The ending drove me nuts. I just thought it was sort of the sour note at the end of the symphony. So I was very happy years later when I found out that that was not the original ending, and the director's cut came out, which got rid of that, got rid of the narration, and then I thought, perfect, this movie is terrific. And with the release of the final cut, it was tweaked a little bit more, and I think improved even a little more, and now it's one of my favorite science fiction films. Anytime I can get a chance to see it on the big screen, I try and go, because it is amazing on a big screen. I'll talk a little bit about that initial reaction. It was released in 1982, which was one of the most amazing summers for sci-fi and fantasy.
It was, but this movie got buried under the load of movies like E.T. and Star Trek 2,
Conan. I think part of the problem is, I mean, it's in a blockbuster summer, and it's not really a blockbuster in the traditional sense. It was marketed as sort of this adventure movie with Harrison Ford. You liked him in Star Wars and Indiana Jones, and here he goes hunting renegade robots. You'll love it. And I think people who went in with that expectation were probably a little disappointed the fact that it's a much more dour, grim, downbeat movie where you're not really cheering on the hero.
The marketing probably killed the movie. It's a neo-noir, it's futuristic at the same time. It has a lot of visuals from the past. So it's this weird merging of cultures and time periods. And it's not, a cute, funny alien movie.
And it's expecting an audience to bring a lot to it, I think. It doesn't necessarily point you in at least the release version did somewhat with the narration, but in general, it doesn't really point you toward conclusions. It kind of lets you stew over some of the things going on in the film, the emotions involved and the morality of it, certainly. And I love the fact that it sort of subverts what you'd expect out of an action-adventure movie. Every time there's an action scene in this, it's either Harrison Ford shooting an unarmed woman in the back or getting his ass handed to him and being rescued by somebody else. It's not really what you'd expect out of the action hero who beat up the Nazis and fought the evil empire.
I think it was wonderful for him to try to break the pigeonhole that he was in. And I think he did a brilliant job as Deckard. I don't think audiences were ready for him to play a character who was not very nice and not in a way that you can eventually come around and kind of love him.
He sort of has a redemption. We see him apparently on the first steps to him being a woke bae, if you will. But he's very dour. He's actually pretty introverted. He's an
asshole.
He's an asshole. He doesn't express himself very much. He's not a very accessible character. And I think part of that is the point that as the movie starts, he is kind of a cold fish. He's not really a very emotional guy, which you'd expect with this kind of job. He keeps his emotions closed off so he can basically assassinate these things that look like people.
He is an asshole. I think that's for the benefit of the story. We're told the only difference between a replicant and a human being is empathy. So our main character, Deckard, has zero empathy. So what's different between him and a replicant?
And he has this ambivalence. I mean, he's not even really interested in his job. He has that statement of replicants are like any machine. They're either a benefit or a hazard. If they're a benefit, not my problem.
Right.
He doesn't really care one way or the other. It's just a job he has to do. And in this case, he really doesn't want to do. And I think that cruelty we see, especially towards Rachel, is part of that. It's unthinking. He's used to dealing with replicants as machines. And as he starts to encounter these replicants that are a little too human, part of his way, I think, of dealing with it is to try and dehumanize them further in his head.
I'm not sure. The first couple times I saw this, I didn't understand any of his emotional evolution. And this last time through, it occurred to me, he brutalizes Rachel. He's cruel to her in his revelation that she is a replicant.
Remember when you were 6? You and your brother snuck into an empty building through a basement window. You were going to play doctor. He showed you his. When it got to be your turn, you chickened and ran. Remember that? You ever tell anybody that? Your mother, Tyrell, anybody? Huh? You remember the spider that lived in a bush outside your window? Orange body, green legs. Watched her build a web all summer. Then one day there's a big egg in it. The egg hatched.
The egg hatched?
And
100 baby spiders came out. And they ate her.
Implants. Those aren't your memories. They're somebody else's. They're Tyrell's nieces.
But then she starts to cry. She's showing an emotion that she should not be able to show. Replicants don't show this kind of emotion. They don't feel. So her behavior, when she behaves more like a human than any replicant he's ever seen, it's too much for him.
I think his behavior is also sort of an overreaction. There's that great moment in the elevator right before where she's in there and he's freaked out by the presence of her. And you just get the sense that she makes him totally uncomfortable.
Of course he does.
It's that uncanny valley thing that, again, he's not used to a replicant that's so good it can fool him like that.
Well, she did fool him. It took 100 questions or so for him to figure out that she's a replicant. I think his fear in the elevator had more to do with just her nature of being a replicant, and replicants are threats.
Well, also, I think it's denial on his part in the sense that if replicants actually have emotions and are more like people, he's going to have to deal with the baggage of the stuff he's done over the course of his career.
Right. But that comes later. I don't think he understands the scope of it until well after the scene where she's crying.
I think that is the moment where his attempt to distance himself from the emotions, from the empathy of them, fails. And he tries to do it, and it just doesn't work for him there.
When they meet, when he goes to the Tyrell Corporation to administer the Voight-Kampff test, she asks him, have you ever retired a human by mistake? And I don't think this is a question he'd ever asked himself. He seemed a little taken aback by it, but no, of course he didn't. But you can tell on his face now he's questioning, has he? Did he make a mistake somewhere along the way? Something else that I found really interesting about Deckard's position in life, he was a Blade Runner. And we're to understand that he's half retired. So in the language of this world, retired is another way to say a replicant has been killed. A replicant is retired. So he's half retired, meaning he's half alive.
And over the course of the film, this idea that he is starting to develop more empathy and emotions sort of parallels what we hear about the replicants, that over time they will develop their own emotional responses, which is another point in the question we'll address later. Is Deckard actually a replicant?
We're told that the replicants are given an expiration date, so to say, because there is a danger at some point they will develop emotions. That's a very interesting question to me. The idea that they know the only thing separating them from the replicants is this ability to empathize and have emotions, and they won't even allow them to get to that point. So it's keeping them down. It's using them as slave labor and disposable commodities, even though there's the potential for them to be just as human as the creators. And we see the replicants all display emotions. Leon and Roy both express fear. Roy and Pris express anger and curiosity. Pris is so curious about people. She leans over JF and sniffs him. What does a real human smell like? Roy expresses grief. Roy expresses pride. Roy has a lot of emotions. Roy's got feelings. And hope. The fact that they all came to Earth seeking an answer and hoping that they would find an answer from their maker. That is pure hope. And then, of course, there's compassion, empathy, the one emotion that we're told they do not feel, and that separates them from humans. They feel.
And also, I'd say despair, not just Roy, but there's a beautiful moment where after Zora is killed and they flip her over and they're sort of testing her for life signs, and you see this single tear roll down her face that I always find heartbreaking. I also like the fact that there's a point, I don't know, over an hour in the movie where Deckard disappears for a good 20 or 30 minutes, and then Roy kind of becomes the main character of the film. For some reason, that always takes me aback when all of a sudden we don't get Deckard for a while, and it's Roy and Pris and following their story. And then Roy really emerges as the hero of the movie.
Yeah, we don't need to follow Deckard at that point. Deckard has gone as far as he's going to go in his emotional evolution. So it's time to look at the other side of the coin and how a replicant becomes more human.
They both have emotional arcs. Roy is the one that's a little stronger and that we kind of relate to, this idea that at the last minute he becomes human in the sense that he finds mercy. And there's the possibility that that act of mercy changes Deckard as well. That Deckard is, in a way, Batty's legacy. Batty knows he's going to die and that all of the experiences he's had are just going to be lost. So if he can get this guy to bear witness to this, that's something. And also, maybe through this act of mercy, change him a little bit.
Deckard learns empathy through his interactions with the replicants. He doesn't have empathy at all. He's a very cold person. Roy is dying, having just spared his life, and Deckard allows him the dignity of death, meaning he does not kill him. He just allows him to die. He lets him squeeze out those last minutes of life because life is all Roy wanted.
And also, right before that, there's that moment where Deckard is hanging off the edge, and Roy asks him,
Quite an experience to live in fear, isn't it? That's what it is to be a slave.
He is forcing Deckard to have this moment of empathy, to feel the emotions that he and his kind have felt all these years.
And the idea that you can't understand what we are going through. I know we have for hundreds of years been dealing with this very thing in race relations in the United States, that you really cannot understand somebody else's experience when it comes down to something so divided. As Roy is chasing Deckard through the building, we have a role reversal. It's a replicant chasing a Blade Runner, putting him in his shoes, by forcing him through the emotions and the physical danger of being chased. I came to the conclusion that the entire chase scene and all of his taunts to Deckard were just a way for him to give Deckard a lesson. Like, this is what it feels like when you chase us down.
I also think there's a bit of a superiority thing in that we get in that scene with Chew. They kill him by, like, tearing his coat off. And basically, he's exposed to this freezing cold that the replicants can take with no problem.
Yeah.
And there's almost this sense that Roy's like, well, I mean, I'm fine here. Why aren't you fine? If you die, that's your own problem. And I feel like that's almost part of it with Deckard as well. Yeah, we see Roy has several opportunities to just out and out kill Deckard, but doesn't. He wounds him and gives him back his gun and challenges him to try and shoot him. And Deckard actually comes close to blowing his head off. I mean, he blows most of his ear off in that moment. He's going to prove his superiority to him by facing him in combat, practically naked, unarmed, while Deckard has his gun, and still come out on top.
But also showing the empathy and the mercy that Deckard would not have ever shown. He comes out on top not just because he's a replicant, but because he's human. He has totally become human in those last moments of his life.
There's a part of me that almost feels like that moment of mercy by Roy is not something he planned, that he didn't really know until the last minute that he was going to do that.
Even so, it's poetic.
Oh, it's beautiful, but I love the fact that we don't really know. And Rutger Hauer's performance in this, I think so much of what makes Roy interesting is Hauer himself. Supposedly, a lot of Roy's stuff is Rutger Hauer going, hey, wouldn't it be cool if I did this? And Ridley Scott's so busy setting up his shots, he's like, oh, I like that. Go for it. He's like, I want to hold a dove. And Ridley Scott's like, sure, sounds great. Go.
Which, by the way, when you grab a dove, it does not give you the power to fly.
I love how calm that dove is. Like, oh, he has got that sort of chicken boo reaction of, what's going on? Huh? Okay, I'm here. But just that unhinged insanity that Roy has in the last scenes of the movie, I think that's all Hauer, and it's such a great, great inspiration.
I cannot imagine anyone else playing this role. He made Roy his own, and I can't imagine it.
And then you have Rachel, who is, I think, probably the most innocent character of the film.
She's a pawn.
She's a pawn, and I love the evolution that when we first see her, she's very cool. She has that slick corporate front.
And you can see that she has power. Within herself, she is powerful.
And there's that wonderful moment when Tyrell suggests him trying the Voight Kampf on her, and there's this tiny little flirty smile that she has right before they start. Like, she thinks it's going to be fun, and maybe she's even a little interested in Deckard at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And then once she starts to suspect what she really is, and has it handed to her by Deckard in such a brutal fashion, oh, your heart just breaks for her, and just the vulnerability comes out. This is easily Sean Young's best performance. I don't think she's ever been this good in anything else.
And Rachel's world is completely rocked by this. I mean, she worked for the Tyrell Corporation, so she was under the assumption that she was human and she was working to create these objects. And then to find out that she herself is the object is really disturbing.
Shakes? Me too. I get them bad. Part of the business.
I'm not in the business. I am the business.
It reminds me, actually, to go a little off topic, of Rachel in Orphan Black.
And especially that moment of her having this snapshot of what she thinks is her and her mother, and to have that so brutally taken away to the point where she just discards the snapshot. And it comes right after that story of baby spiders eating their mother, the death of the mother, and sort of the psychological death of her mother in her eyes.
Mm-hmm.
That this person that she has memories of did not really exist, at least for her. That's just cruel and horrible. And the idea of having to live with that knowledge now.
Deckard, he is so mean to her. She comes to him hoping that he can give her some sort of explanation because Tyrell won't talk to her anymore for reasons we're never told. And he's cruel, throwing back her nature in her face and then later on physically assaulting her.
And that occurring after she saves his goddamn
yeah,
wife.
I know.
Yeah, the fact that she's with him at all. I mean, I know part of it is that unfortunately at this point she doesn't have anywhere else to go.
She has no choice, though.
Yeah.
So we know at this point, and Rachel knows at this point, that she's a replicant. and the power dynamic is totally unbalanced. He's a police officer, which gives him very high status in this society. And on top of that, he's a Blade Runner whose job is to kill her. So if she doesn't obey him, she runs the risk of dying.
And I think the filmmakers want us to believe it's a case of she wants to be with him, but is now distrustful of her own emotions, knowing that her memories are fake. So I think he thinks he's helping her by forcing her to do this and to be a person. But, it's just so cruel. It's a little mind-boggling, that particular scene, because I think the moment right before when she's playing the piano and isn't sure if it's her abilities or these memories, and he actually tells her, you play beautifully. It's the only kind thing he does in the movie. Compliment her and let her own it, that no, this is her playing the piano. This is her ability. It's hers. If they had just kind of ended it there or built it from there where he's trying to reassure her that no, he's accepting her as herself. But it's followed immediately by just this violent forcing of her.
Well, the compliment was meant to put her at ease so that he could assault her. He goes in to nuzzle her neck. She gets up and leaves.
Well, after she draws back, he moves a little forward. And he's like, nope.
Yeah, and he was rejected. That's a flat out rejection. He forces her to stay in the apartment. He slams her up against a wall. He forces a kiss on her, and then he forces her to kiss him and say all these things he wants to hear. He is treating her as a sex object. He's treating her like a pleasure replicant. And we are supposed to believe, as an audience, we are supposed to believe they're in love, and that's insulting.
And it's an interesting contrast when we see Pris and Roy together. Their relationship is really romantic and very sweet and nice.
It is.
When they kiss, it's beautiful, where Deckard looks like he's trying to bite her lips off.
Yeah, and they're vulnerable with each other in a way that Deckard and Rachel aren't. So we both agree that while the love scene, as they call it, was meant to be a love scene, it reads as a rape.
Oh, it's super icky. It's definitely rape territory. And it's interesting to look at it in the wider kind of exploitation of women sub-theme that's going through the movie. There's that. The fact that Pris is a pleasure model, basically a robotic sex worker for military clubs. You have Zora as this snake dancer in this peep show kind of thing in the club. And to have the good guy continuing this really creepy exploitation that the film seems to be painting is horrific. It's really twisted.
Oh, there's definitely problems with the male gaze. The idea that the only females in this movie are used for pleasure in one way or another. And then there's the virgin whore dichotomy. We have Rachel as the virgin, who we can assume is deflowered by violence. And then we have Pris and Zora as deceptive sexual beings. So we have a Virgin Mary and we have an Eve/Mary Magdalene. They're each side of the coin of male fantasy. You know, you flip the coin, you're getting one or the other and you're happy with it. It doesn't matter which one it is. And this is a hallmark example of something that's in noir films. We have the damsel and we have the seductress. And to talk a little bit about the noir influence, Deckard fulfills his role as the dominant male. And he's also the heavy drinker, the hard-worn detective.
The morally dubious character.
Right. This movie leans heavily on noir tropes.
Yeah, besides that, of course, there's the element of crime, which we get with cops hunting criminals, in this case, replicants. The dark visual style is certainly there. And something I find in a lot of film noirs, this contrast between sort of romantic ideas or mindsets being crushed by harsh reality.
Gritty reality.
And we see that many times, certainly with Rachel finding out about her true nature. Their romance and this idea that no matter what they do, it's sort of doomed on some level because they probably don't have very long lifespans. And Roy's quest to try and save his friends and how that is just met with complete failure and never really could have had any other ending, as it turns out. Let's talk a little bit about the director, Ridley Scott. I kind of have mixed feelings about Scott because his films always look amazing. The amount of visual detail is incredible. He's terrific at creating an atmosphere and environment. I'm not always sure he's the best at story. It seems like his most successful films generally are the ones that happen to have strong scripts. We've seen that recently with The Martian, Black Hawk Down, Alien. All those had really good, well-conceived screenplays, and I think sometimes when it's a case of him being in charge of the story, the movie kind of goes askew. And sometimes I feel like this movie was like Casablanca, one of those cases of things just happening to work out. A really good set of actors, great technicians, and the whole thing managed to work despite a lot of chaos on the set.
I think Ridley Scott has an incredible visual vocabulary. His films, like you said, they're gorgeous, and he has a way with creating tension through the visuals. He does work better when somebody else is taking care of the story, or if the story is very straightforward and it can all hang on the style.
I do remember hearing in interviews with a lot of the actors that at this point he was much more focused on being up on a crane, lining up a good shot. And a lot of the actors, he encouraged them to just sort of do their own thing and stay out of his way, which worked well with most of them. But Ford really needed direction. He was having trouble with this character. And apparently, as a result, this movie wasn't really a great experience for him. So I think that his performance is as good as it is a tribute to him as an actor, just trying to find the right tone for this character. And he shot a lot more film than he was supposed to on this movie and printed up a lot more takes, which is one of the reasons why it went over budget. He would spend hours getting a shot, trying to make sure the shadow is just right. Meanwhile, he has hundreds of extras running around and all this smoke and all these lights and all this stuff waiting so he could get the shadow just right.
In his defense, it was worth it. I could watch this without the sound on just because it's that beautiful.
It really, really is. The atmosphere of this movie is amazing.
It's gorgeous. It does borrow a lot from the feel of Metropolis. Just giant buildings that are brutalist in nature almost. Very, very straight, strong lines.
And this idea of the past having the future just kind of built on top of it. A lot of older architecture with weird technical stuff thrown on it.
Yeah.
Older cars, older fashions, all this stuff. It's this dirty, junked out sort of future. And even gross as it is with the pollution, the overcrowding, I find it kind of attractive.
It is beautiful, but it's not a world I would want to live in. It's toxic. The very first shot we have is looking over the city and seeing these plumes of fire coming up from what I can assume are oil refineries. And there are several of them. It's not just like there's one and they're in the middle of the city.
It's almost always raining. Everybody always looks sweaty, so you imagine it's actually really warm and damp out there.
Yeah, everybody is really dirty, dark colors, and all of the advertising, neon lights and advertising. We have a bombardment of consumption. Because this world is so unappealing, it looks like everybody is downtrodden and dirty, and the air cannot be good, so we can assume the food is not good, the water is not good, everything is polluted in one way or another. The way humans cope is with things of comfort, which are usually consumptive in nature. So advertising is a big, big deal in this world. And big literally, as in the signs are just as big as buildings.
And even if you're inside, you can't escape them. You just hear them in the background of every scene, that one Chinese woman singing about whatever it is. And in Deckard's apartment, how the lights intrude. They always see those flashing and moving lights all the time. There's no chance for kind of a peaceful, quiet moment anywhere in this city.
And just going back a minute, you mentioned the city being plopped right on top of the old city. It's interesting that you say that, because it seems to me that we have a decaying old world and it's being replaced by a world that's supposed to be sleek and shiny, but because it's squishing the old world, it's helping to decay the old world, which is decaying the new world, and it's a little messy, but the new world coming in is accelerating the decay around them. The progress is creating more pollution, which is making the animals die, which is making the humans sick. And so it's just this idea of progress in Blade Runner is that it's destructive.
Going back to the look of the film, the amount of detail that Ridley Scott forced all the designers and art directors to make, I mean, you can look at any section of any frame and just see all these incredibly crazy, beautiful details.
It is a gorgeous film.
Sonically, too, that noise of the traffic signal, cross now, don't walk, don't walk.
It's so angry. It's like ordering.
It's very pissy. Or just the cop cars just move on, and it's all just flooding at you at the same time. And I have to comment on the guns, especially Deckard's gun. I love his pistol. It's one of the most gorgeous movie firearms ever. In fact, we just saw it again recently in Death Note, where for some reason the characters have the exact same gun and they run around shooting each other with it.
Oh, it's Adam Wingard. I'm sure he loves Blade Runner.
But even the sound effect, it feels like Deckard's walking around with this little cannon in his hand. It just,
yeah.
The effects that we see it has on people are just, brutal. The other thing I love in the design, the costumes, all the bizarre, futuristic, retro 1940s look that that so many characters have. Deckard's amazing trench coat, Rachel's incredible suit with those crazy
Rachel
shoulders.
with her giant shoulder pads.
And I love this detail that most of the characters we meet wear kind of tweaked 1930s, 1940s clothing, but the replicants have a completely different thing going on. It's all leather and fishnets and the poofy hair, and it has a very punk aesthetic, which I almost feel like hints at this generational conflict. And so the replicants are the punk kids rebelling against a generation that doesn't understand them and wants to dehumanize them.
And absolutely, we're using conflict between humans and replicants to explore the tense relationship between generations, between an older generation and a younger generation. It's the fear of being replaced. And that's exactly what the humans are going through. They would literally be replaced with replicants if they weren't held down.
And that parental theme comes up in a couple different ways. Again, the spider memory, the idea of these baby spiders eating and destroying their parent. And when Leon shoots Holden in the opening scene, it's right after the "I'll tell you about my mother" line. That he's asking about a mother he doesn't have. And of course, the relationship between Roy and Tyrell, where he actually calls him, at least in this version, father. And he is the prodigal son. And also this multicultural aspect. There's Chinese and Japanese everywhere. You get the sense of all these different cultures sort of mashed together and not really fighting with each other. They've just sort of merged on some level.
Yeah, it's like the world has literally become global. There's bits and pieces of different cultures and different languages all over Los Angeles.
Right down to the city speak language that Edward James almost speaks through most of the movie, which apparently he actually made up himself. It was in the script and he went to a language coach and started mixing all these languages together. It's mostly Hungarian with bits of Japanese. And I guess if you see the film in Hungary, there's a lot of really funny llines that he's throwing at Deckard, like calling him horse dick at certain points.
Man, they should have had subtitles for that.
Admiral Kovachin engem bitte. He say you under arrest, Mr. Deckard.
Got the wrong guy, pal.
Lofa, nehochma. Te vaya Blade,
He say you Blade Runner.
Tell him I'm eating.
Captain Brian Toga. Enio Mayo.
Considering the multiculturalism of the movie, I'm a little disappointed the cast isn't a bit more diverse, and I know that's sort of part and parcel with the time, but we only really have 2 non-white actors in it, one of them being James Hong, who it's always great to see him, but he doesn't really have a huge part, and Edward James Olmos.
All of our other minority characters are just background.
Exactly. And considering this sense of the movie telling the story of the oppressed, I really wish they had diversified it a bit more. I know originally they wanted to cast Frank McRae from Batteries Not Included as Leon, and I think that might have helped a little bit, but
I do almost feel like by casting an all-white major cast, it may have been down to, well, we'll take race out of the equation so that we can have being a replicant be the stand-in for race. And I think it succeeded at the time because I don't think an American audience would have been able to stomach African-American replicants. 'Cause that would have felt a little too heavy-handed. But now looking at it, it feels like there's great injustice done by ignoring that.
even cast them in parts like, say, Holden, the other Blade Runner, or Bryant. I think they could have gotten them in there somewhere.
Speaking of the world and the advertising, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the advertisement for going off-world.
Ooh, yes.
It's this giant blimp in the air with bright colors, and it's very loud, and it seems to be operating 24 hours a day, trying to get people to go off-world.
A new life awaits you in the off-world colony. The chance to begin again in a golden land of opportunity and adventure.
You can start new, and you get your very own replicant to help you break in the new world wherever you decide to colonize or wherever you're sent to colonize. And it's interesting because Los Angeles, and we only see Los Angeles, but Los Angeles, it's so densely populated and heavily polluted and gross, and it looks like people are struggling just to even exist. But they have to have a giant, screaming, bright advertisement. It's almost as if no one wants to go. And I can't help but wonder why. Why do they not want to go? If life in Los Angeles is very, very difficult and we don't know if their chances are good of surviving just due to pollution, why would they not want to take the chance somewhere else.
Well, it could be that instead of doing terraforming, it's literally just oxygenate little modules on other planets like the station from Outland or something. Who wants to live in this tiny little metal box with probably recirculated air? It doesn't sound all that attractive.
It's probably not, but they're living in tight quarters on Earth. I can't help but wonder if it's due to the replicant that you would need, basically, to help you survive in this new terrain. Assuming that the replicants can survive conditions that humans can't, we saw them survive freezing temperatures in Chu's lab.
And Pris puts her hand in boiling water with no bad after effects.
So humans would be dependent on the replicants to help them through any kind of harsh environments. And replicants are illegal on Earth because they're dangerous. We're told they're dangerous and they're not allowed here, but they can go in space and they're allowed to be on colonies. I think people don't want to go off-world because they would be too dependent on this thing that they have been raised to deeply fear.
That actually reminded me of where Britain had abolished slavery, but not in its colonies. There was another decade before they actually got rid of slavery in the colonies.
Exactly.
And it was part of the appeal. And of course, how much of America was dependent on slavery when the colonies were established.
And the off-world colonization really is a parallel to the colonization of the Americas.
There's a strong sort of, I think, subversive poke at America throughout this whole movie. There's that moment when they visit Chu and Batty actually quotes from America Prophecy by Blake, a poem about the American colonies uniting against the tyranny of England, with this idea of Orc as this spirit that gives the colonies power.
Fiery the angels fell. Deep thunder rolled around their shores, burning with the fires of Orc.
I almost see it as Roy's sort of identifying with Orc, and he's going to be sort of that presence for replicants everywhere and fight against tyranny that way.
He's a revolutionary. He's one of 6 who escaped violently to come to Earth on a mission to meet their creator and ask for more life. It's a reasonable request.
And that creator is sort of this symbol of American industrialism.
Exactly. He's high atop his ivory castle kind of stuff.
And how far this industry is willing to go to squash the rights of this sentient race, basically to make profits and keep the whole evil machine going.
Yeah.
That sort of, commerce is our goal here. More human than human is our motto. It's such a creepy, dehumanized idea.
One other thing I wanted to discuss about the society in Blade Runner is that there's this deep sense of paranoia. It just pervades the entire city. Who amongst us is a replicant? Let's seek them out. It's very McCarthyism. And then the police are everywhere. In the whole film, you see these bright lights sweeping back and forth, and those are the police lights. Those are the searchlights. And they're everywhere. Deckard himself gets pulled aside to make sure that he is where he's supposed to be. So that's just him, a Blade Runner. How many times is a regular person being pulled over? And the paranoia of the elite who have removed themselves from society as a whole by, going as high into the air as possible.
And in some of the scummier sections that Deckard has to frequent in his investigation, that moment he has with Taffy Lewis where immediately he just thinks he's another corrupt cop who's looking for a handout.
Yeah.
There's this real sense of humanity sort of degraded at this point. Everyone's just scrambling to survive and try and make as good a life as they can. In the midst of this humanity, we have J.F. Sebastian, who, along with Rachel, is one of the nicer characters, but I can't quite call him innocent. You have this guy, he's a genetic designer. He's so lonely he makes his own friends, these mechanical toys that seem to be somewhat biological too. And it occurs to me, well, that's not too far off from what they're doing with the replicants.
Yeah.
That he's creating these things to love him and keep him company. And whether it seems like a benign motive, it's still kind of creepy. And as a result, when the replicants show up, he's ready to accept them as friends because he's actually kind of used to that. Even if we see he's kind of afraid of Roy, and he's definitely in lust with Pris. So he's caught in this weird sort of trap.
There's something so strange about JF and the way he's acted. I can't help but wonder if we are to read his character as autistic or maybe just very socially awkward. His speech patterns are a little strange.
I almost feel like it's from him not being used to talking to actual people. I think the only person that we actually see him talk to in the course of the film who's not a replicant is Tyrell. And we get the sense he kind of does his work maybe remotely, that he doesn't really have as much need to go into the office and deal with actual people, that he's very isolated and alone in this rundown building, the only tenant that we can see, surrounded by his collection of toys. It's like he's created his own creepy little world. It's almost the lower budget version of what Tyrell has done. There's also that great moment where Pris and Roy are trying to convince him to take them to Tyrell. And while Pris is laying on, like kissing him and saying, oh, you're our bestest friend in the world.
Best and only friend.
Best and only friend. And when he finally seems to cave in and agree, there's this look of just despair on his face. He just kind of crumples and almost looks like he's about to cry. And I don't know if it's this fear of them or this sense that he knows if he lets them in to see Tyrell, there's a good chance that something really bad is going to happen.
It's almost when a friend convinces another friend, usually a small child, to do something they know is wrong, but they want to remain friends, so they have to play along with it.
And poor JF, for all of that, still gets himself killed by Roy.
I think Roy even apologizes, doesn't he?
He's like, oh yeah, sorry if Sebastian come, and chases him down almost politely.
Yeah.
Let's discuss Gaff, because he's a really interesting, enigmatic character.
Man, he isn't in the film for most of the film, but when he does show up, he takes the whole film.
Part of that is just Edward James Olmos and his presence and all the weird decisions he makes. Olmos is always just standing there watching from a corner.
Deckard has this costume that's pretty much a stereotypical noir film. He's got the big trench coat. He's really disheveled. And then we have Gaff. He has on a fedora and a bow tie, and everything is just slightly garish, but still stylish. And his eyes, the actor has in contacts that make his eyes look icy blue, almost white, and it's so striking.
When he's giving Deckard those kind of probing, baleful stares, it's really spooky. And I love the detail that he appears to be injured. He's got a limp and he's using this cane the whole time. And I almost saw him as this embittered Blade Runner who was really good at his job and somehow got injured in the line of duty and now can't really do the job anymore. And so he's left shadowing Deckard everywhere and making sure he does the job.
Bryant actually says that Gaff has a lot to learn from Deckard. So I almost considered Gaff a new guy.
And in the original film, I remember there's this narration that sort of demeans the character, that he doesn't want Deckard around because he's gunning for a promotion and that's all he's really interested in. And with that taken out, and with his actions in the rest of the movie, Gaff becomes much more interesting. That he's the observer of everything going on, and in the end sort of passes judgment. But like Roy, it's an act of mercy. He knows where Rachel is. He could have gone in and shot her, but doesn't. Lets her live and lets Deckard go off with her.
I find him interesting because in that moment, the act of mercy, Gaff has not gone through the emotional journey that Deckard went through. So we can kind of guess that Gaff has always had this empathy and compassion, and that he is more human than Deckard was in the very beginning of the film. It's also possible that being a Blade Runner dulls your sense of empathy and your sense of compassion over time. And if Gaff is new, he just hasn't gotten there yet.
Also, I love the origami. I love the fact
it's wonderful.
He doesn't speak much, at least not in English, so he communicates so much with these little origami. Taunting Deckard with the chicken one, that weird one that appears to be a guy with an erection when he's on the middle of the investigation.
Is that what it is?
Well, if you look, it's got 2 legs and it's got one other extra little piece sticking out.
Honestly, I was like, hey, it looks like a matchstick man. I don't know why. Matchstick man? I don't know.
Well, I don't know. Maybe that's just like a little extra thing so he can stand up straight, but it looks like he's got something going on.
Maybe it's his cane.
Maybe. And then, of course, finally, the unicorn, which hints that Gaff knows a lot more about Deckard than we would think.
Yeah, that's intriguing, because how would he even know anything about these unicorn fantasies?
Well, again, that goes into the is Deckard a replicant question. To the point where I've heard some people theorize if Deckard's a replicant and he has fake memories, he might actually have Gaff's memories. That maybe when Gaff was injured, if he was a Blade Runner, that they found the best way to make use of his experience was just to take it out and put it into a replicant.
That's really fascinating. Part of me wants to believe it because it's really great. And the other part is like, no, I kind of love not knowing.
Well, that's the beauty of it, is the complete uncertainty on so many aspects of this movie. So let's discuss that. One of the big lingering questions in the movie, and one that was really intensified when the director's cut came out and Scott put in that extra little shot of a unicorn that Deckard seems to be dreaming of. Is Deckard actually a replicant? What's your take?
I think there are lots of arguments for and against, and I accept that I'm not going to be satisfied with either answer, so I'd prefer to really just linger in this uncomfortable I don't know space.
And I think that's almost more the point. That seems like a very Philip K. Dick idea, that we're never really totally sure whether he is or not, and he's never totally sure whether he is or not.
And it's Rachel who brings it up to him. She asks another question that I think really, really starts to knot him. She says, that Voight-Kampff test of yours, have you tried to take that test yourself?
And I always took that as being read two ways. One, the idea that he could be a replicant, but also, have you ever tested whether you actually have any real emotions or not, or if you're just this cold-blooded monster?
Yeah, the idea that even if you're human, would you pass this test because you aren't human?
We have a couple clues that seem to hint one way or the other. The fact that all the replicants have this eye glow at certain points in the movie, and there's a split second, which might be a production mistake, where Deckard has it too, where he's moving in the background behind Rachel.
You had to point it out to me, and it was subtle, but even if it's a production mistake, I love it.
The other big one is the fact that we see Leon collects these photos that apparently he's kind of pretending that he has these memories of family and home. And Deckard has the same thing all over his piano, all these strange old photos that don't seem to have much connection to him that we can see.
And most of the photos are very old.
And I had my own weird theory, which I, at the time, thought, oh, it's brilliant, I've cracked the movie, and I'm sure many other people have come up with this theory as well. Due to a mistake in the original film, Bryant mentions that there were 6 replicants. They broke into the Tyrell Corporation. One of them got fried running through an electrical field, which left 5. The reason for this was originally there was a 5th replicant named Mary, that they actually cast an actress, Stacey Nelkin, in the part, the lead actress in Halloween 3, the one with the masks, but had to cut her role due to time constraints and budget. But that line was still left in there by mistake, so I just assumed, okay, there's one more replicant, it must be Deckard. The idea that he was one of the original 6, he got captured, they took him to Tyrell and gave him these fake memories to make him think he was a Blade Runner. Maybe part of a pilot program where they'd use replicants to hunt replicants. It would make sense, minimize the risk to actual humans, and then have Gaff shadow him around to make sure he doesn't go rogue. Now, that doesn't totally work with the final cut because they've fixed that mistake, and there are a few other questions that linger. Roy Batty's speech about, I've seen things you people wouldn't believe, wouldn't make quite as much sense. Although there's also the fact that Roy somehow knows Deckard's name in that last fight, even though there's not really any opportunity for him to have learned it.
Yeah, that is true.
I thought you were supposed to be good. Aren't you the good man? Come on, Deckard. Show me what you're made of.
If Batty recognized him as being one of his friends who's been reprogrammed, that has an interesting double meaning.
I love that because it's like, you're Blade Runner. You're supposed to be the good guy. You hunt down us. We are the bad guy. That's how you view us. So show me how good you are. Kill me.
And there's also that scene where Deckard goes to try out the Voight-Kampff machine on Rachel. And if you believe that Deckard is a replicant that Tyrell has altered, it's not just a case of Tyrell showing off Rachel, it's Tyrell getting a look at his new creation in action and seeing if it ever actually suspects. So that shit-eating grin of pride has a double meaning there, too, that Tyrell's looking at this guy and going, oh, look at what I've created, isn't it amazing?
There are a couple of other verbal hints that might bring us to Deckard being a replicant. When he's being briefed, Deckard asks Bryant, why are the replicants here? And Bryant says, you tell me, pal, that's what you're here for. It makes it sound as if, well, you'd know, you're a replicant, so why don't you tell me?
There's also the fact that Bryant gives a lot of exposition in that scene that if Deckard was an experienced Blade Runner, he should know already. All the details about Nexus 6 and the 4-year lifespan, considering the opening crawl establishes it was the Nexus 6 model that caused the laws against replicants. He should know some of this stuff.
Right. The other verbal clue is Gaff near the very end.
You've done a man's job, sir. I guess you're through, huh?
And he's done a man's job, meaning he's not a man, but you've done a good job, so you're good enough to be called a man. It's a very, very odd sentence.
And in that the last line of, too bad she won't live, but then again, who does, could be pointing right at Deckard, too.
So something we haven't talked about is why make replicants? Why do they exist?
Well, I would assume for the same reason that people own slaves, to do all the things that they don't want to do themselves by forcing somebody else to do it. In this case, though, I think they feel like they can justify it by saying, well, we're not really enslaving any kind of live thing. It's something we created. And since we created, we have the right to do with it as we see fit, which is a theme we see in a lot of these movies about artificial intelligence.
But interestingly, they look like people. They're beautiful, they're strong, they're intelligent, they have memories. Why, if the uses are utilitarian, why would you make them so human? It seems like an exercise in ego.
It is.
To be a creator, to be a god.
There's that. To put it cruder, when it comes to robotics, I think it's so men and women can screw it.
That's interesting because we never find out if there are any male pleasure bots. But assuming that, why waste your time building a construction replicant with a body, with a human body, when you could just save all that tech for the pleasure models? It seems like, well, we did this because we can, and we're really proud of this creation we made, and we can acknowledge that they might be too human. And I think that too human possibility, there's some pride there.
Certainly in Tyrell, that he keeps trying to take them as human as possible.
He loves this. He loves playing God.
And the way he relates to Roy, I think he kind of overestimates exactly how in awe the replicants are, or should be, of him. There is this sense of him playing God in that he lives in a giant, what's essentially a pyramid.
Yeah.
And that moment where he calls Roy the prodigal son.
Well, living in a very tall space, for one, he's elite, so we know he's going to be elevated anyway. But the replicants have gone on this very long journey.
A pilgrimage?
A pilgrimage, you might say. And they have to go from the physical plane at the surface world to the spiritual plane, the higher up in the sky, his apartment. So they're moving from a space where human stuff and pain and misery up to a place where they can ask for more time. And when he comes in, his God is a disappointment. And in this case, his God turns out to be as effectual as the great and powerful Wizard of Oz. He stood as a symbol, someone we just have to get to who will solve all of our problems. But no, this guy is not going to solve anything for you.
Which is interesting if you consider that Roy has not extended his life, but at least extended what he represents by saving Deckard, that, like Dorothy, he's kind of found the solution on his own.
Right.
I find it also interesting to look at the replicants and what we see them doing in the movie and how it sort of reflects their various specialties. That Leon, we're told, is basically manual labor. He loads heavy things. And we see that he infiltrates Tyrell's company as a worker. And when he fights Deckard, he's mostly just using that brute strength, fling him around left and right. Zora's the assassin, and of course we see that in the way she tries to kill him. Mm-hmm. And I also have to make a special note of that moment when she punches him in the stomach. The sound effect is incredible. It sounds like she's going to put her elbow right through his stomach. Pris, being essentially the sex worker, uses her charms to sort of bring Sebastian to their side. And a nice little touch is that Pris's incept date, being the pleasure model, is February 14th, 2016.
Nice. I did not notice that.
Of course, Batty is the strategist. He develops the plan to reach Tyrell, but also we see how that specifically comes into play with the chess game that they use to actually get access to Tyrell. Perhaps we should talk about the connections with the animals.
Yeah. Animals are everywhere in this film.
There's the fact that so much of the Voight-Kampff test is focused on animals and death of animals and violence toward animals. I don't know if it's a case of this idea that humans would have more empathy toward animals rather than other humans.
That's probably true. How many movies do we watch where people get killed, but we see a scene with a dog who might get kicked, and it is horrifying?
It also might be a reflection of the original book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, where a big sub-theme of that was that most animal species have gone extinct, and to own one is actually a status symbol. And in fact, Deckard's whole motivation is he owns an electric sheep and he really wants to own a live goat. And so he's killing the replicants so he can afford one.
We actually see that theme, the extinction of animals, in the movie. We find out that most of the animals we see are fake. They're grown, basically, and that they're very expensive even then.
And live ones even more so. Zora has that line about, would I be working here if I could afford a real snake?
Exactly. But even Tyrell has an owl who's been created.
Although, when Deckard asks her that, if you watch Sean Young's lips move, she actually mouths the words, "Of course not." I think originally it was supposed to be a live owl that Tyrell owned.
That would make more sense for the story because he is very rich and powerful and he would have the resources for a real owl.
But at the same time, he's the kind of guy who'd want to show off his amazing artificial owl.
Yes,
too.
it's true. And it does seem as if most of our major characters have an animal that's attached to them, almost like a totem.
Of course, yeah, there's Deckard with the unicorn, obviously.
Right.
Rachel has the spider.
That's really the only animal she has any attachment to.
Roy sort of has two.
He does. First watching this for the animals, I thought, oh, okay, it's the wolf when he's howling because he is the last replicant from his group. He's the lone wolf. He's howling and chasing people. But then he comes across this dove and it's so much gentler than the wolf. And it does have an effect on him. It's after finding the dove, he finds peace.
It's the dove of
symbolism.
Peace.
So I almost think Roy underwent a change, and in that changed his totem.
There's Zora with the snake, of course, which was actually Joanna Cassidy's real pet snake. Pris, there's a couple, I've heard it said that she has the raccoon because of the makeup, but there was actually a deleted scene where we would have seen her in JF's apartment surrounded by mice, and like having them all over her and, you know, petting them and cuddling up with them. So I think that probably would have been hers. Tyrell obviously has the owl, and Leon has the tortoise from his Voight-Comp test.
There's basically a turtle flipped upside down. Why aren't you helping the turtle?
What do you mean I'm not helping?
Every single time we get to the question of why aren't you helping, my answer is because you're an asshole.
The question of Gaff, would we associate him with his little chicken origami that he makes?
I don't know, honestly.
He doesn't really have one otherwise beyond that.
I consider him an outlier when it comes to that.
And Bryant seems to have on his lamp, there's that picture of like somebody next to a dead cow or a dead steer.
It looks like a trophy photo. I find it really interesting that if we're to kind of understand that animals are sort of like replicants in that they are creatures with very little power when it comes to humans.
Livestock, essentially?
Right, exactly. So Bryant, whose job is to send out people to kill them, for his totem to be a dead steer that somebody is posing with, oh, that is painful.
It also has this kind of cowboy connotation, which again goes to that American kind of, pull out your gun and shoot him. Going back to Deckard and the unicorn, there's a couple interesting things with that. Of course, the unicorn is sort of associated with feminine purity, so could we see the unicorn as symbolizing Rachel, this sort of perfect woman for him?
I don't know. I have always had trouble with the unicorn. It seems like for him that these are flashes of memory or maybe something he had read and he just imagined the scene.
Yeah, I always took it as sort of a dream that he's having, that he's kind of half drunk at the piano and just has this vision for a second. There's also the whole mythology of unicorns being tamed by a virgin, which again could be Rachel.
There's also the possibility that, like when we talk about, oh, you found a unicorn, it's something very rare, something to be treasured, something new. And yes, that could be Rachel. Rachel could be the unicorn. She could be the one replicant who is human. Plus, he's the only one who has an imaginary creature.
If he's a replicant, it also could be symbolic of him, this fictitious animal, a myth, something that doesn't really exist. There's also a motif of eyes throughout the movie as well.
So many eyes.
I mean, the opening shot, or nearly the opening shot, is what we can assume to be Holden's eye looking out over the city. Of course, the focus on eyes in the Voight-Comp test. Chew with his little eye factory.
I made your eyes.
The glowing eye effect that we see in all of the replicants at some point. And the fact there's always violence to eyes. Leon is about to poke out Deckard's eyes before he's killed. Roy actually crushes Tyrell's eye sockets.
Something I found really, really interesting. Tyrell is the only character who wears glasses. And he doesn't just wear glasses. He wears the thickest glasses with thick bifocals on them as well. His vision is imperfect. But also his vision, as in his vision of the future, his vision of what humanity and replicants should be, it is imperfect.
And of course, there's the running theme of Roy and the things that he's seen have changed him and kind of shaped who he is. And all these humans can't see them and therefore can't understand or have true empathy for him.
Then they start with the sight. The first place they visit to shake somebody down about a location is Chew. The first sense you depend on to look for something is your eyes.
Let's talk about the music score.
It is incredible and highly influential. We still hear echoes of this score now.
And unlike a lot of symphonic scores of the day, it doesn't use the sort of John Williams leitmotif idea where each character has a theme or a little motif that keeps playing throughout the movie. It sort of changes from scene to scene.
Yeah, there's a theme here or there, but for the most part, the music is its own character.
Gorgeous. And the score is so pliable that you can have a romantic theme like that, the really creepy, ominous theme when Roy visits Tyrell, that pounding futuristic theme that runs over the end credits. All these different moods. And I remember for years you couldn't get it. They released this recreated version that was actually an orchestra, and it was just pitifully terrible. And that was all you had for years until finally, I think it was 1992, they actually released it on CD, and oh, thank God for that.
So it occurred to me that I didn't actually know what Nexus meant. I had a general idea, but they talk about the Nexus 6 and that, we're assuming there's a Nexus 1 through 5. So I did a quick search, so forgive me, this is probably a quick Google definition, that it's a connection or series of connections linking two or more things. So it's kind of like a hub. And I like that because these replicants really are the link between humanity and what comes next.
My big problem is that a couple of years ago, a phone company actually made a phone called the Nexus. And I think actually the estate of Philip K. Dick tried to sue over them using the name
Good
Nexus
for them.
6.
I mean,
now I just picture people's phones turning against them.
Give it time.
Give it time. I also wanted to make a note of the editing in the movie. The movie was edited by Terry Rollins, who worked with Ridley Scott before in Alien. And as an editor, he has a habit, and I noticed this more and more the more I watch this movie, of reusing shots. Mm-hmm. And usually they're cut in so well you don't even notice, but examples of being like, the first two shots we get of Roy Batty in the movie are shots from other places in the movie. Huh. His hand clenching up from the end, and then while he's in the phone booth, we hear Leon knocking, and he kind of turns to look. If you look carefully, that's actually a shot from later on when he's talking to Tyrell.
I did not notice. That's impressive.
There's a lot more in the fight between Batty and Deckard. The moment where he looks down at Priss's body before he kisses her is actually a shot from later on when he pulls Deckard's arm through the wall. You can tell because it's that same wall and he's already sweating. When Deckard drops his gun when he's climbing up on that thing, his kind of pained reaction is when he's about to set his fingers after they've been broken.
See, I didn't know any of this, and it just shows me how much an editor has an influence over the story and how the story's told.
And how you can grab a shot from anywhere else in the film, and if it's put in the right place, it can convey the emotion properly that you need to. There's a couple scenes I think were actually shifted around. If you watch the scene after Deckard retires Zora, he goes immediately to the bar, gets a drink, and runs into Bryant and Gaff, and then chases Rachel. Originally, that scene was supposed to take place very differently. He kills Zora, and then he sees Rachel and goes after her. In fact, if you watch the scene where he goes after Rachel, he's pushing through a crowd of police and onlookers from the crime scene. And then she would have saved him from Leon, and then when he goes to the bar, if you look in the background, Rachel is standing a few feet away, just out of focus. He even looks at her when Gaff shows up, like he's trying to keep her hidden. The other one is late in the movie when Roy puts the nail through his hand. If you look at the room that he's in when he does that, he's in the bathroom where he has the fight with Deckard a moment later when Deckard hits him with that pipe. So I think the nail going through the hand was actually supposed to happen after that fight. I think they changed it so you could have that moment of Deckard kind of tying off his fingers and Roy fixing his hand at the same time. The idea these two guys are both wounded and dealing with their wounds at that particular moment. And that putting the nail through his hand kind of gives him the energy he needs to burst through that wall in that next moment. A little trivia about the movie. The title is a little curious. There's nothing in here to suggest why they're called Blade Runners. It turns out it's actually an unrelated book by Alan E. Norse that was adapted into an unfilmed screenplay by William Burroughs. Hampton Fancher, the screenwriter for this film, loved the title and decided they'd use that, and Ridley Scott bought the rights to it. So it's in the film, but there's no explanation why they're called Blade Runners. I've heard they tried to explain it as, they operate on the knife edge of human and robot, but
that's
just
ridiculous.
It's one of those things where it just sounds cool.
Yeah, and Blade Runner does sound cool, but I don't know, fork trotter.
It's a better
Spoon amble.
Because in the original book, it was about like black market surgeons and the guys who would smuggle their tools around. So it made a little more sense. I mean, it beats the original titles, which were just Android and Dangerous Days. So.
Deckard's Run. Alternate titles.
He's going to take a chance, Carousel. Some interesting alternate casting for the movie. They actually wanted to get Debbie Harry to play Pris.
I would have actually loved that. I'm glad they didn't, just because I think Daryl Hannah does a fantastic job.
She's really good.
I love her in this role, and I actually don't know if Debbie Harry is a good actor. So
she was good in Videodrome.
Oh, wait, I do know. So easily that I forget these things. Yeah, she did a good job in that.
She did, yeah. The only reason was her record company wouldn't give her the time off to shoot the film, and that's something she really regretted.
Aww.
Although I almost think she would have made a better Zora than Pris. Although I wouldn't replace Joanna Cassidy. I think she's fantastic. Also, Joe Pantoliano was supposedly considered for J.F. Sebastian. I think they did better with William Sanderson. I think Pantoliano would have made Sebastian seem sleazy.
Yeah.
And it's no reflection on him. That's just the characters he tends to play.
I would have bought Pantoliano as Bryant.
Oh, yeah. In the scramble to fill up the urban landscapes in some of the model shots, if you look carefully, you can see a model of the Millennium Falcon that one of the effects guys was building as a hobby, and they went, we need this, and grabbed it and stuck some fiber optic lights and a couple structures on it. It's on the left side of the screen as Gaff's spinner lowers down towards the police station. The police station building, in fact, is actually made from the same mold that they used for the center of the mother ship from Close Encounters from the special edition.
Nice.
And in the wide shot, the famous wide shot of like the Coke sign on the right-hand side that all the ships are flying through, there's a sort of oval-shaped building right around the center of the screen. That's actually the ship from Dark Star turned on its back.
Huh.
And watch when Leon first shoots Holden in the opening scene. If you freeze frame it on that first shot, you can see 4 frames of this weird purple beam shooting out of the gun. Apparently, the original idea was that the guns in this movie wouldn't shoot bullets. They'd shoot these weird beams that it kind of makes it a black hole gun, and the beam would hit somebody and kind of screw up their internal organs from the inside out. But it was the only time they actually did the effect in the film.
It almost seems like a very expensive effect for something that you really don't see unless you pause it.
And also, I like the idea they don't use laser guns, but use bullets and projectile weapons. It just makes it seem meaner.
It's the
and more
retro
brutal.
future.
It is, yeah. Shall we discuss the multiple cuts of the film?
Oh, there are so many.
The original cut has the ridiculous happy ending where we conveniently find out that Rachel has no termination date and therefore they can go and live happily.
Ever. It has the most egregious voiceovers through the entire film that really just describe what's going on the screen. What we are seeing anyway, it's being described to us by a very bored and irritated Harrison Ford.
There's an urban legend that he performed it badly so they couldn't use it.
But they used it.
Anyway.
It's terrible.
He says that's not the case, that he did give it his all. He just sounds so unhappy. And if you listen to some of the audio outtakes, you can hear him in mid-line suddenly going, this is bizarre. This is weird.
And it is. He's right. It is some of the worst voiceover I've ever heard.
And they were supposedly literally writing it on the day. There was a guy with a typewriter just click, 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 click in the next room, and he'd do a couple pages and go, here.
So like a college sophomore.
They don't advertise for killers in a newspaper. That was my profession. Ex-cop. Ex-Blade Runner. Ex-killer.
The original script had voiceover, but it was much more of a noir voiceover where he's reflecting on himself.
Like a Sam Spade kind of thing.
Exactly. And this one is much more just, oh, look, here's a scale. I found photos. What could they mean? That's, oh.
She was in the elevator. I was in the elevator. We left the elevator.
Here, let's ruin this moment with Roy. Roy loved life. Because he loved life, he saved me. Yay. It's like...
I don't know why he saved me.
And that ending, and that's what killed the movie for me the first time, that we have all this disgusting, crowded city, and yet all these characters can just go a little north to where it's green and beautiful and verdant. And
I never understood that. That ending didn't work for me on many levels, but the most striking reason is because when they're driving away into the sunset, it's gorgeous. There's green, there's blue sky, the car is red, very vibrant colors, not the right palette at all for this movie. And why would anybody live in Los Angeles where it's crowded and dirty and wet and gross when they could just go a little further north, have some green plants and open fresh air?
I almost wonder if Terry Gilliam was intentionally spoofing that when he did the ending of Brazil. I almost expect Michael Palin and Peter Vaughan to suddenly pop their heads in frame at the end of it. The aerial photography was actually from The Shining. It was outtakes from the opening scenes. Kubrick said they could use all the footage they want as long as they didn't use anything he actually used in the movie. There was also an international cut that had a couple little seconds of violence here and there. The scene where Roy puts the nail through his hand is more gory. Him killing Tyrell is more gory. There's a little extra violence in the fight between Pris and Deckard. And that was pretty much it for Blade Runner for a long time until it was going to show at this special repertory screening, and they sent the wrong print. They accidentally sent the work print that had no... Well, it was good because it had no narration and no happy ending.
Oh, so somebody saw the right version.
Yeah, and the crowd went nuts over it, and that inspired Warner Brothers to pony up some money and release the director's cut in 1992, which was that version... No narration, no happy ending, and Ridley Scott got to stick in the one shot of the unicorn. And that wasn't really the full director's cut Scott wanted to do, but that was what he could do at the time because he was busy. And that was the movie for a while. That was the definitive version. And then the final cut came along, which adds back in the extra moments of violence from the international version, recolors the movie a little bit. The colors are a little bit pushed toward the blues and a little more higher contrast. And Scott used a lot of digital effects, but used them the right way. He didn't go all George Lucas and put digital replicants running around or anything like that. He used it to fix errors.
The erasure of wires.
Fix some of those continuity errors that revealed the scenes being moved around and stuff. Those first shots of Batty in the phone booth, they tried to use computer effects to make it not clear it was the same shot. Added some backgrounds to some of the model shots that they weren't able to do previously. Added Joanna Cassidy's face over the stunt double when Zora is running through the glass, which looked terrible before and now looks really good.
And as a side note, in the scene where Zora is falling through the glass, we see very clearly that her shoes are not high heels. They are kind of like high-top sneakers, and they look great. I honestly think they should have just had her in the high-top sneakers to begin with. There was no reason for her to be in those high heels, and if you're going to show the sneakers as often as you do, just go with comfort.
Because when I think of the heels, I always wince at that moment when she runs up over the car. I imagine her tripping and falling over and breaking an ankle or something.
The heels are pretty, but she's already suspicious of him. And even though she's a replicant, don't disadvantage yourself by putting your heels on.
Yeah, she's an assassin. She should be practical and think about escape before attack.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the influence of the movie. It's pretty huge.
It's far-reaching.
I mean, you look at most big science fiction things from the 80s into the 90s into the current film environment. It's all over the place. I mean, I don't think we'd have a Ghost in the Shell without Blade Runner. The new Battlestar Galactica, tons of influence, certainly thematically with the Cylons, to the point where Edward James almost actually had Tricia Helfer watch this movie in preparation for playing a Cylon.
12 Monkeys.
12 Monkeys is another big one. Like I mentioned, I think Brazil takes quite a bit from that. The environment in that film owes a lot to this one. Almost any kind of futuristic dystopia, I think, borrows a ton.
Pretty much. Even if it only picks one or two, there's all a direct route back to Blade Runner. And Blade Runner did have its own influences. It was influenced by Metropolis. It definitely was influenced by the noir films. So it was taking its own bits and pieces and distilling it into something so influential to the movies we see today.
And it also had a big influence on the cyberpunk movement, this idea of this skepticism of technology and this real cynicism about what kind of future technology is going to bring us. There's the influence on fashion, of course. Alexander Wang, Gucci, and Balenciaga have all done fashion shows that have a lot of clothing influences from this film. I mean, just look at Pris. She's everywhere in fashion.
Pris and Zora are runway ready.
There's also the Blade Runner product placement curse, where a lot of the companies that had advertising in this film underwent some really bad days after this. Atari, obviously, Pan Am, RCA, Cuisinart, Bell Phones, even Coca-Cola, which is all over the place. This was a couple of years before they introduced New Coke, and we saw how that went.
So putting aside Coca-Cola, the rest of those companies were made obsolete by better methods of doing what they did.
And it's actually kind of spilled over into other properties. The movie Soldier with Kurt Russell is considered sort of a sidequel to this because it exists in the same universe. It was written by one of the same co-writers, David Peoples. And there's a lot of references. If you look at Kurt Russell's character's battle record, you can see references to the Battle of Tannhauser Gates and the Shoulder of Orion. And one of the smash spinners, the flying cars, is part of the wreckage on the junk planet. But even the very concept of that movie was inspired by an alternate opening for this they didn't use, where Roy's character is dumped as trash on this planet and gets up and escapes, and that's the beginning of his little rebellion. As well, if you look on the extras for Prometheus, the Ridley Scott movie, he actually put a little slide text Easter egg in there that reference Tyrell and suggests they actually exist in the same universe. That the robots in the Alien films were made as a replacement to replicants to be more stable.
I like the idea of films with sort of similar themes eventually having a tenuous connection. And I think that's how you make a shared universe.
And of course, finally, we have the sequel coming out, Blade Runner 2049. And I'm hopeful. I'm a little worried because this is one of those movies I always thought you really don't want to do a sequel. And I thought, all right, if you do another movie in the same universe, that's fine. But it's one of those things where I almost feel like they're going to have to finally reveal whether Deckard is a replicant or not. And I don't know if I really want to know that.
Yeah, I think I'm cautiously optimistic.
It looks very pretty. It's got a great director.
Great cast.
Great cast. One of the original screenwriters, Hampton Fancher, is back. That's a good sign.
I do have my fingers crossed that they allow more ambiguity than films usually do these days. I don't need an answer as to whether or not he's a replicant. I like that it hangs in the air and that I have to think about my reasons for and against it. I agree. I don't know how they're going to pull off a sequel without exploring that, but we'll see.
I also hope that, much like this one sort of turned the tables on it being just an action thriller, that the ads make it look like this big conspiracy thriller, and I hope there's more to the movie than that it does kind of have these interesting questions of morality the way this one did. Okay, so what's your favorite scene?
Most of the scenes that I really like in this film are so small and intimate. They're not a full scene. They're just moments. One of my favorite is one of our first shots of this city and how close and grimy and dark and wet it is. And watching Deckard navigate this world, it feels very real. And it's beautiful. And I just love that.
For me, it has to be the big confrontation between Roy and Tyrell. I love that scene. Just this idea that he is meeting what is, for him, basically his god.
Yes.
And telling him, I want more life. And they have this debate about the scientific limitations of it, of their genetics. And it comes down to Tyrell basically telling him, well, you have a limited lifespan. You've done some amazing stuff. Live it up.
The light that burns twice as bright burns half as long. And you have burned so very, very brightly, Roy. Look at you. You're the prodigal son. You're quite a prize.
I've done questionable things.
Also extraordinary things. Revel in your time.
Nothing the god of biomechanics wouldn't let you in heaven.
And humans also run into that. We have, in the grand scheme of things, very limited time. And who wouldn't want to find someone to ask for more?
But then it comes to that moment of incredible blasphemy. He gets to kiss his god on the lips and kills him.
That's a Judas moment. Judas kissing and identifying Jesus. So we have Roy identifying Tyrell. And then the God is dead nihilist view of things, coming from an existential place going into nihilism.
Yeah, that idea that, all right, you've destroyed God, now what do you have?
Exactly.
And from that point on, I think Roy goes a little mad for the rest of the movie. And just that incredible Vangelis ominous music in that scene, that moment in the elevator where he looks up and he sees the stars moving away, almost like he's being cast down from heaven, and has that weird shudder. Oh, it's incredible. Okay, what are your recommendations?
This is a hard one because there's just so many influences, but I thought I should start off with one that actually came before it, and I think maybe had an influence on Blade Runner's look a little bit. THX 1138. And it's, of course, Lucas's first film but just the stripped down look of it. And I know the difference here with Scott's world, everything is just packed in and dirty. And in Lucas's world, it's very stripped down and clean. But we're seeing the same world in a way from a lighter point of view and a darker point of view.
And they're almost polar opposites in that THX is this very tightly ordered sort of world, and
very
Blade
controlled.
Blade Runner is everything's just gone to hell.
So that's my first. And just quickly, Snowpiercer, dealing with the retro future and going up from the physical to the spiritual realm to find your maker. And of course, Total Recall and another one that came before it, Logan's Run. So there's some give and take from before and later on.
For me, the first direct recommendation I can think of is a South Korean movie called Natural City, which I don't think has gotten a lot of attention, but it was very good. It almost feels like it could be the sequel to this movie, a spiritual sequel. And that's the same thing. There's a group of cops that hunt down these renegade robots, and one of them has one of these pleasure robots called Dolls that's nearing the end of her life, and he's desperate to figure out a way to keep her alive and try and maybe transfer her consciousness into something else. Obviously, it's not on the same budget as Blade Runner, but it does a pretty good job of approximating the look, and boy, it's really heart-rending at points. The other one, and this is a movie I really feel like did not get a fair shake, and I really dig it, is Steven Spielberg's AI. Again,
I saw AI in the theaters, and I was very, very disappointed because I walked in thinking I was going to finally get something resembling an Asimov world. I was going to get my Daniel R. Oliva. I was going to get my robots, and it wasn't about that. And I liked it until about 3/4 of the way through, and it fell apart for me. I did love what it was exploring, similar themes of finding the maker, in this case, his parents, and the journey being the entire experience of his life and how brutal it is for outcasts.
Well, also this idea of you're creating these beings and now you're creating them basically to function for loving other people, and they don't really have much of a say in the matter.
And what kind of responsibility is that for the people they're programmed to love? Obviously, the mother was able to just let her child go and not able to stop the child from loving her or looking for her. And that's totally irresponsible.
And like in this movie, you have sort of this God figure. In that case, it's William Hurt, who seems a lot more benevolent. But the more we find out about him, the more that, seems nicer on the outside, but he's just as blind to what these robots need and the fact that they are actually having real emotions.
Yeah, and that they do have needs.
Yep. If I can throw in one more, it would be Dark City, which again has the sci-fi noir thing going on. Gorgeous looking movie. Plus, similar to some of the questions in this movie, it's this question of what makes a human. What makes a person who they are? Is it what they remember? Is it how they act and behave? And it's just fascinating. I love that film. Okay, that ends the discussion, but not the conversation. If you'd like to have your say about Blade Runner or feel that we missed something, check out the comments section for this episode on CinemaSpection.com and start talking. Email your comments, complaints, questions, and suggestions to CinemaSpection@gmail.com. You can also like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter. Our show is available on iTunes and Stitcher, and if you like what you hear, please subscribe to us, and if you have a moment to spare, please leave us a review there. We appreciate any feedback you can offer, and your reviews help improve our visibility. We'll be back to discuss another movie next time. Until then, thanks for listening, and remember to keep watching closely. There's more to a movie than what's on the screen. Blade Runner. I keep doing that. Blade Runner.
The Blade Runner.
Blade Runner, where we is by Warner Brothers.
We need your Blade Runner magic.
He's a goddamn one-man slaughterhouse. Elmer Fudd is Blade Runner.